My mother chose a wedding caterer over my life. When she finally showed up, I was already gone. Color drained from her face. The rain that Tuesday was the kind that turns every headlight on the interstate into a smear. I was 40 minutes from home, driving back from a client meeting 2 counties over, and the last clear thought I had was that I should have paid for the hotel. I never saw the truck cross the median. People always want that part. They want the flash, the sound, the moment you knew. There isn't one. There's the wipers going, and then there's a paramedic's face upside down over mine and a pair of shears going up my sleeve. They told me afterward that the car rolled once and came to rest against the embankment on the passenger side, and that the extrication took 22 minutes. 3 ribs broken on the left, a collapsed lung, a tear in my spleen, and a slow bleed in my abdomen that nobody found until the second scan. In a trauma bay, nobody talks to you. They talk over you, across you, about you, in a flat-ass shorthand that sounds like men reading numbers off a board. Somebody had scissors in my jacket. Somebody was pressing on my stomach in a way that made the room go white at the edges. A woman kept saying my name and asking me to squeeze her fingers, and I kept trying, and I could not tell whether anything was happening at the other end of my arm. Then a man leaned into my field of vision, close enough that I could see the fine print of exhaustion around his eyes, and told me they were taking me upstairs. He said it the way you tell someone that the store is closing. Then he straightened up, and I heard him say to somebody behind him, "Get her family here tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight." A nurse came around the left side of the bed holding up a phone. She was maybe 30, and her badge was on backward, and she had a stripe of somebody else's blood dried along her forearm. She asked me for a number. I gave her my mother's, because that is the number I have given every intake form since I was 19, and because in the part of your brain that runs the body when the rest of you is gone offline, there is only ever one number. She dialed it and put it on speaker and held it near my ear because I could not lift my arms. It rang 4 times. I heard the sigh before I heard any words. Not a gasp, not a what, not an oh god. A sigh. The long kind. The kind you make when somebody asks you to move your car out of the driveway on a Saturday. "We're in the middle of a tasting," my mother said. "Your sister has been planning this for a year. The deposit is non-refundable." The nurse said she was calling from the trauma center. She said my name. She said I had been in a serious motor vehicle collision and that I was critical and going to surgery, and that the surgeon had asked for family in the building. There was a pause on the line, and in that pause I could hear a room behind her. Cutlery. A man's voice describing something, the way a caterer describes something. My sister laughing at whatever he said. "Then I'll come when things settle down," my mother said. She hung up before the nurse could get another word out. The nurse stood there for a second with the phone still up, looking at the screen like it had lied to her. Then she put it in her pocket and put her hand flat on my forehead, which nobody had done to me since I was a child, and she said, "Okay, just that, okay." What I did not know, because I was gone about 90 seconds later, was that she walked to the workstation by the doors and typed that entire call into my chart before she did anything else. Date, time, direct quotation. It is standard practice when a listed contact declines to respond to a critical notification, because the hospital has to show it tried. She never mentioned it to me. Not that night, not the whole week. She just did her job and put it in writing and let it sit there. The surgery took 4 hours and 10 minutes. They took out my spleen, packed the bleeding, wired what could be wired, and put a tube in the left side of my chest to reinflate the lung. I came up out of it in the ICU sometime the next morning, which I know now, though at the time morning was just a word for the fact that the light in the room had a different color than the light I remembered. The first thing you notice is that you cannot get a full breath, not because anything is blocked, but because the machinery of breathing has been broken, and every attempt at it runs into a wall of pain about 2/3 of the way down. So you learn to take small breaths, and you get very interested in the numbers on the monitor, and time stops being a line and becomes a series of separate rooms you wake up in. The second thing you notice is who is in the chair. There is a chair in every one of those rooms, pushed up against the wall by the window, and it is there for a reason. Down the hall there was a man who had come off a roof, and his wife was in that chair with a puzzle book, and his brother took the night shift so she could sleep. Across from me there was a woman in her 70s whose son slept sitting up for 3 days with his shoes still on. My chair had my jacket on it. That is what was in my chair. The jacket they had cut off me in the bay, folded by somebody kind, waiting to be claimed. The nurse from the trauma bay found me on the second day. She was not assigned to me anymore. She worked downstairs, but she came up on her break with a paper cup of ice chips, and she sat on the edge of the chair with my jacket still on it and asked how the pain was on a scale. I said 7, and she said try again, and I said 9, and she went and found somebody, and the somebody adjusted something, and it became a 6. That was the pattern of that week. Every good thing that happened to me was done by a person who was being paid to be in the room, and every one of them did more than the pay covered. They asked me twice a day in the gentle scripted way they have whether there was anyone they should call. The first 2 times I said my mother was aware. That is the phrase I used. My mother is aware of the situation, which was true. She was aware. She was, at that moment, extremely aware, sitting in a chair somewhere holding a folder of menu options, having been told by a stranger in scrubs that her daughter might not live through the night. The 3rd time they asked, I said no. The night nurse wrote something on the whiteboard by my door, in the section they use for goals and notes, and I could not read it from the bed. I asked her what it said, and she said it said that I was to be woken every 2 hours to breathe into the plastic thing. I found out later there was a second note in the electronic chart, made the same evening. Social work consult. Family dynamics. Somebody in that building had looked at a 60-second phone call from Tuesday night and drawn a conclusion about my entire life, and had been right on the first try. To understand the phone call, you have to understand the arithmetic of my family, which was settled long before I was old enough to have a vote in it. My sister came 7 weeks early. She spent the first month of her life life in an incubator with a tube in her nose, and my mother spent that month in a plastic chair beside it, and by the time they brought her home, the shape of everything had been decided. She was the one who had almost been lost. I was the one who had not. That was the whole system. Everything else was just the system running. I was 4 when she came home, and I do not remember a version of the world before it. What I remember is being told constantly and warmly, and in a tone that sounded like a compliment, that I was the easy one. You are so easy. You never give me any trouble. Thank God I have one who doesn't need anything. That is a sentence a child will build an entire personality out of if you say it enough. Needing nothing became the thing I was good at, the way another kid is good at the piano. I learned to want things quietly, and then to stop wanting them, and then, eventually, to not notice that I had. When I was 11, there was a band trip. 4 days, a bus, $190. I had the flyer in my backpack for 2 weeks before I worked up the nerve, and my mother read it at the counter and said we would see, which in that house meant no. And then that same month, my sister was enrolled in a dance intensive that cost $600. I did not throw a fit about it. I want to be honest about that, because it matters for everything that comes later. I did not fight. I went upstairs and I told myself that the dance thing was important to her in a way the band trip was not important to me, and I made that true by deciding it was true. And I came down for dinner, and I was pleasant. My mother told me at that dinner that I was the most mature 11-year-old she had ever met. That is how it works. They do not have to break you. You do it yourself in advance so that nobody has to be the bad guy, and then they thank you for the labor. At 14, I started keeping the household bills in a folder because my mother would let the water get shut off. At 16, I had a job. At 17, I filled out my own financial aid forms at the kitchen table at midnight while she sat in the next room, and when the number came back, she said, "Well, look at you. You always figure it out." I was proud of that. That is the part I still cannot fully explain to people who did not grow up in it. I was proud. It was the only currency I had ever been paid in, and I spent 30 years working for it. The money started when I was 22. My sister needed a car for a job she had for 6 weeks. She had no credit and no down payment, and my mother called me at work and cried until I said yes, and I co-signed for a 4-year loan on a used sedan. 2 years later, the collection notices started coming to my address because my address was the one that had never changed. I paid the remaining $11,000 out of the emergency fund I had been building since I was 19, because the alternative was watching my own credit go down with hers, and because by then I understood something about the way my family worked that I had not understood at 22. It was never going to be split. It was only ever going to move. After that, it moved regularly. I covered her apartment deposit at 25, and then the broken lease at 26. I covered a semester of a program she did not finish. I covered a dental thing. I paid $4,000 for a boutique that existed for 11 months, mostly on a website that was never finished, and I have a folder of receipts from a wholesaler in another state that I have never been able to bring myself to delete. I want to say something here that sounds worse than it is, and then I want to explain it. I kept a spreadsheet, not to hold it over anybody. I never once showed it to a living soul, not to my mother, not to a friend, not to the man I dated for 2 years in my late 20s who eventually asked me why I always seemed to be waiting for a phone call. I kept it because I am the kind of person who keeps things, and because some quiet part of me believed that one day somebody would ask, and I wanted to be able to answer accurately instead of emotionally. The number at the top of that spreadsheet on the night of the crash was $119,000 and change. Nobody in my family had ever asked. That is the punchline. Not once in 15 years had anyone said, "What has all of this cost you?" The asking only ever went the other way, and it had a particular grammar to it. Nobody ever said, "Give me." They said, "We were hoping," or "It would just be until," or "Your sister is in a really bad place right now." And my mother had a phrase she used when I hesitated, which she used so often that I can still hear the exact pitch of it. Family lifts each other up. I built a career while all of this was going on. I want that in here too, because the story people tell about someone like me is that she was weak, and I was not weak. I was extremely competent in every single room except one. I had a good job with a title and a team and a reputation for being the person who reads the whole contract. I read other people's contracts for a living. I just could not read my own family. There was a blind spot there, shaped exactly like a door I kept hoping would open. The venue happened in March. My sister got engaged in October to a decent man who works in commercial refrigeration and who has, from the first day, been better to me than my own blood. In March, the two of them found a place an hour outside the city, a restored barn with a pond and a stone terrace, and a price that made me put my coffee down. $41,000, half at signing, half 30 days out, and a contract with a personal guarantee clause because the venue had been burned twice by couples who walked. My sister could not sign it. Her credit is a crater. Her fiancé could have carried maybe a third of it. So on a Thursday evening in March, my mother arranged for the venue coordinator to come to the house, and she made a pot roast, and she set the table with the good plates that only come out for things she has already decided are going to happen. The coordinator was very pleasant. She had a leather folder and an iPad, and she talked about the pond at golden hour. My sister cried a little, the good kind. Her fiancé kept looking at me across the table with an expression I did not understand at the time and understand completely now. Then the folder came around to me, open to the guarantee page, with a pen laid across it. I asked one question. I asked what happens if the balance is not paid. The coordinator said, very gently, that the guarantor becomes responsible for the full contract amount. I looked up and my mother was already looking at me. She has a way of doing this where she says nothing at all and the silence does the work, and the whole table gets very quiet, and you become aware that you are the only obstacle in the room. Family lifts each other up, she said. And here's the thing I have to own. I signed it. Nobody held my my hand. I am a person who reads contracts professionally, and I read that one. And I understood the guarantee clause better than anyone else at that table. And I put my name on it anyway because I wanted, at $41,000 a serving, to be a person my mother was glad to have at the table. My sister hugged me and said I was the best sister in the world. My mother walked the coordinator to the door and then came back and cleared the plates and did not say thank you. And I noticed that she did not, and I filed it where I file all of it. Her fiancé walked me to my car. He stood there with his hands in his pockets for a second, and then he said, "You know you didn't have to do that, right?" I said it was fine. He said, "That's not what I asked." The first 3 days in the ICU, I watched the doorway. That is not a figure of speech, and it is not self-pity. My ribs were wired, and there was a tube in my chest, and I could not turn my head more than about 20 degrees to the right without the whole left side of me lighting up. So the doorway was most of what I had. It was the doorway, the ceiling tile with the water stain shaped like Ohio, and the monitor. Every time somebody's shoes squeaked out in the corridor, my chest did something stupid and hopeful. I had my phone on the tray table, face down, because face up meant I could see the screen not lighting up. Twice a day, a nurse would move it when she wiped the table, and she would always put it back exactly the way she found it. And I never asked her to do that. And she never mentioned that she was doing it. There were 2 calls that week from my family's side of the world. The first was my aunt on the second day. She had heard from a cousin who had heard from somebody at my mother's church. She cried on the phone in a way that felt real and asked me twice what the doctors were saying. And then she said in a lower voice, "Honey, your mother told everyone you were in a fender bender." A fender bender. The second was my sister's fiancé. He texted on the third day at 6 in the morning, which is when men like him are awake. It said, "I just found out. What do you need?" I stared at it for a long time. Then he texted again, "I'm sorry. I didn't know until an hour ago." I believed him. I still do. The nurse from the trauma bay kept coming up on her breaks. On the second night, she sat with me through a pain spike that ran about 40 minutes, and she did not say anything sympathetic, which I appreciated more than I can explain. She talked about her dog. She told me a long, boring, wonderful story about a dog that eats socks. At some point in there, I said out loud in the dark that I did not understand what was wrong with me, that my own mother would not come. And she said, without missing a beat and without looking up from the line she was flushing, "There's nothing wrong with you." She did not say your mother is a bad person. She did not say she is sure my mother would come soon. She just took the question out of my hands and put it down somewhere I could not reach it. And then she went back to the dog. On day 4, the surgeon came in and sat down, which they do not do casually. He said the first 48 hours had been closer than he had told me at the time. He said the bleed they found on the second scan had been the real problem, and that if the transport had been slowed by weather or by the extrication running long, we would be having a different conversation, meaning we would not be having one. Then he said, and I have thought about this sentence every day since, that people in my condition generally do better with support in the room, and he asked whether there was anyone we should be calling. That is 3 times now that the building had asked me. I said there wasn't. He nodded and did not push and made a note, and about an hour later, a woman knocked on the frame of my door and introduced herself as the patient advocate. She had a lanyard and a soft voice and a manila folder, and she asked if she could sit, and she sat in the chair with my cut-up jacket still folded on the arm of it. She said that part of her job was making sure that the people listed on my paperwork were the people I actually wanted listed. She said it neutrally. She offered it the way you would offer somebody a blanket. I said my mother was my emergency contact and my healthcare proxy, and had been since I was 19. She said, and this is the sentence that started everything, "Would you like her to be?" I did not answer. I looked at the ceiling tile shaped like Ohio for long enough that it got awkward, and she waited it out, and then she said there was no decision to be made today, and left the folder on the tray table. I did not open it for 2 days. That afternoon, my aunt called again to say that my mother had been asking around about whether the hospital would let her handle my affairs while I was incapacitated. My affairs. I was 4 days out of an abdominal surgery, breathing at about 60%, and the word that had traveled through my family's phone tree was not, "Is she alive?" It was affairs. I want to be fair here, because this is the part where people stop believing you. I told myself she was scared. I told myself people process fear as logistics. I told myself she was going to walk through that door any hour now, and that I would forgive her instantly, sloppily, completely, the way I always had, and that it would be embarrassing how fast I did it. I really did believe that. I believed it right up until the next evening, when my phone finally lit up on the tray table, face down, buzzing against the plastic, and my whole body reacted before I could get my hand to it. On day 5, my mother finally wrote to me. It came in as one long message, the kind that takes 4 or 5 screens on a phone, and I had to hold the phone up over my chest with both hands to read it because my grip was still not right. She said she had not slept in 3 days. She said she had been sitting out in the car in the driveway at 2 in the morning, asking herself what kind of mother hears that her child is on a table and stays where she is. She said she had picked up her keys 11 times. She used that number, 11, and there is something about a specific number that makes a thing feel true. She wrote about the night my sister was born early, and about how she had promised herself in that room that she would never lose a child, and how somewhere in the years after that, she had gotten the promise turned around backward, and had spent it all on the one who nearly went instead of the one who stayed. She wrote that she knew about the car loan. She wrote that she knew about the apartment and the boutique. She said she had always known and had always let herself not know, which is a distinction I did not think my mother was capable of drawing. And then she wrote that she was sorry. She used the word. She wrote, "I am so sorry." And in 31 years of being her daughter, I had never once received that word from her in any form. Not written, not spoken, not implied. I read it 4 times. I cried so hard that my chest seized, and the monitor alarmed and the night nurse came in at a jog, and she found me holding a phone with both hands and shaking, and she thought something had ruptured. It took me a minute to get enough air to tell her that nothing was wrong. I told her I had been wrong about my family. I said that to her, out loud, with my face wet, at 9 o'clock at night in a room I could not sit up in. I said, I think I've been unfair to my mother. She read the message because I asked her to, because I wanted somebody to witness the good thing. She read it all the way down and she said, that's a beautiful letter, and I did not hear what was underneath the way she said it. She asked if my mother was coming in the morning. I said I was going to call her first thing. I had the whole thing planned out already, that fast. I was going to be gracious. I was not going to make her explain. I would tell her the room number and I would ask her to bring my charger and a hairbrush, because asking somebody to bring you a small, stupid object is how you tell them you have let it go. I fell asleep that night for the first time all week without watching the doorway. The second message came in at 11 minutes after 6 the next morning. I know the time because I have looked at it more often than is healthy. 6:11. 9 hours and some change after the first one. It said, good morning, sweetheart, and then it got to it. The venue's automatic payment had declined on Friday. The card on file had been flagged and frozen by my bank after the accident, the way banks do when your card sits still for a week and then something in their system notices. The coordinator had called my mother twice. The venue was holding the date until Monday and then releasing it to a couple on the wait list who had been asking about that weekend since January. She needed my card details. She needed them today. She wrote that she hated to bring it up right now, and that she would not be bringing it up at all if there were any other way, and that we could talk about everything else once the wedding was behind us. Everything else. That is what the letter had been. Not a reckoning, a category. Everything else, filed and tabled, to be revisited at a later date pending the successful completion of the primary matter. I lay there and read the two messages back to back, the long one and the short one, and I watched the second one turn the first one into something else entirely. The way a second photograph of the same room can show you the wire running out of frame. She had not been sitting in the driveway with her keys. She had been sitting somewhere with a phone in her hand and a problem in front of her, doing what she has always done, which is to survey the terrain and locate the resource. The apology was not an apology. It was the throat clearing before the ask. And the worst part, the part I have not said out loud to anybody, is that for about 90 seconds I considered sending the numbers. I actually did. I lay there with my thumb over the screen and I thought, if I send this, she comes today. She would have. That is the true and ugly heart of it. $41,000 would have bought my mother into that chair by the window inside of 2 hours. And I knew it. And there was a part of me so hungry that it was doing the math. I put the phone face down. I did not cry again. Something in me went very quiet instead and very organized and stayed that way. That morning, I asked for my records. You can do that. Most people never think about it, but you are entitled to your own chart. And there is a department in the basement of every hospital whose entire job is handing it over. The unit clerk gave me a form and I filled it out with my left hand because my right still had a line in it, and I asked for everything from the night of the collision forward. I did not have a plan. I want to be accurate about that. I was not building a case. I asked for it because I wanted to know how close I had actually come, and because the surgeon had said a sentence on day 4 that I could not stop turning over, and because when I am frightened, I read documents. That is my version of prayer. It came up that afternoon in a plain envelope, 100 and some pages, most of it numbers. I read the trauma bay notes, blood pressure, base deficit, units transfused. I read the operative report, which is a strange thing to read about your own body, written in a flat voice by a man describing an organ he took out of you. And then, in the nursing narrative, between an entry about a blood gas and an entry about a line placement, I found it, time-stamped, initialed, and set down in the neutral font that hospitals use for everything from a bowel movement to a death. Critical notification attempted to listed emergency contact via speakerphone at patient bedside. RN identified self and facility, reported patient status as critical, pending emergency laparotomy, advised family presence requested by attending surgeon. Contact stated, quote, we're in the middle of a tasting. Your sister has been planning this for a year. The deposit is non-refundable, end quote. RN reiterated critical status. Contact stated, quote, then I'll come when things settle down, end quote. Contact terminated call. Patient awake and oriented at bedside during notification. Attending in charge RN notified. Patient awake and oriented at bedside during notification. That was the line that got me, not the quotation. The nurse had gone out of her way in the middle of the worst night of her shift to record that I was awake, that I had heard it, that whatever was going to happen next in my life, there would be a document somewhere in the world stating that this had occurred and that I had been present for it. For 31 years, the story of my family had been unwritable. Every time I tried to explain it to anybody out loud, it came out sounding small and petty and unbelievable. And I always ended up doing the thing where you laugh and say it's fine. They're just like that. And here it was in a hospital's own handwriting. I sat in that bed with 100 and some pages on my lap, and I did not feel sad. I want to be honest about that too. I felt something closer to relief. The specific relief of a person who has been told for her entire life that she is imagining the weather, walking outside and finding it raining. Then I picked up the manila folder the patient advocate had left on my tray table 2 days earlier, and I opened it. She came back the next morning and she was not soft about it, which I needed. She said we could go through it in whatever order I wanted, and that nothing was permanent except the things I wanted to be permanent. And then she took the cap off her pen and asked me what I wanted the hospital to do if my mother called. I said I did not know that was a question. She said it was very much a question. Here is what I signed over that day and the next, propped up at 30 degrees, because that was as far as I could get. I removed my mother mother as my emergency contact and as my healthcare proxy. 13 years she had held that. 2 lines and an initial, and it was gone. And the strangest part was how ordinary it felt, like changing an address. In her place, I named a fiduciary through my attorney's office with the patient advocate as the interim point of contact. I filed a written restriction on my directory information. That is the one most people do not know exists. It means that if somebody calls the main number and asks whether I am a patient, the hospital does not say she is in room such and such, and it does not say she has been discharged. It says it cannot confirm that information. As far as the front desk of that building was concerned, I no longer existed in it. Then I called my attorney and had her draw 2 letters. The first went to the venue and the coordinator and the venue's general manager, and it withdrew my personal guarantee on the contract, in writing, effective immediately, with a relevant clause quoted back to them. It was not a favor and it was not a threat. It was a document doing exactly what documents do. The second went to my bank, converting the frozen card to a closed account and moving what was in the joint savings my mother had been a signer on since I was in college into an account under my name alone. There was $8,000 in that account, and every dollar of it was mine, deposited by me, and she had never once put a cent in and had never once been told she could not take one out. And then I arranged the transfer. I was 2 days from being cleared for a rehabilitation facility, and my insurance had approved a bed at a place 90 minutes north with a pulmonary program. My surgeon signed off. The discharge coordinator booked private medical transport for the following afternoon. The patient advocate asked me one question at the end of all of it, which I think she had been holding on purpose. She asked whether I wanted her office to notify my family that I had been discharged. I thought about it for a while, and I said no, don't notify them. But if they come, don't lie to them either. Tell them exactly what the policy is and nothing more. She wrote that down word for word. She said, so, we follow the restriction. I said yes, follow the restriction. The withdrawal letter reached the coordinator on Thursday morning. I know how that landed because her fiancé told me afterward, and because a version of it came at me in real time through my phone, which I had turned face up again by then. Thursday, 11 o'clock. A call from my mother. No voicemail. Thursday, 11:40. Text. Call me please. Thursday, 12:15. Text. The venue is saying something about a letter. That has to be a mistake. You're on medication. That one is my favorite, in the way that a scar can be your favorite. Not is this true. Not are you all right. You're on medication, meaning you are not competent, meaning the thing that had happened to me was now available as an argument. Thursday afternoon, my sister called 4 times in 9 minutes. Thursday, 4:50. Text from my mother. I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is not who you are. That is the one I read twice. This is not who you are. She was right, in a way she did not intend. It was not who I had been for 31 years. That was rather the whole point. Friday morning, the balance came due. $41,000, with no guarantor attached to it, on a contract that named a bride with no credit and a fiancé who could carry maybe a third. The coordinator ran it, and it failed, and she did what a coordinator does, which is start calling. By Friday afternoon, my aunt had called me twice to relay what was going around, that I had lost it, that the accident had done something to my head, that I was punishing my sister for being happy, that I had always been jealous, which is a word that had never once been used about me in my life until the exact moment I stopped paying for things. And still, in all of it, in the calls and the texts and the relayed messages coming through 3 different women in 2 area codes, not one person asked whether I could breathe yet. I know because I checked. I went back through every message that week and I read them all in a row, looking for it. The way you check a pocket you already know is empty. Nobody asked. Her fiancé texted Friday night. He said, I told them I'm not doing this. He said, whatever happens with the wedding happens. He said, I'm sorry it took me this long, and I told him it had taken me 31 years, so he was doing fine. Day 7, they discharged me at 10 in the morning. That word does a lot of work and almost nobody knows what it actually means, so here it is. Discharge does not mean you leave the building. It means the hospital closes you out. Your chart is finalized. Your name comes off the whiteboard at the nurse's station. The bed is released to housekeeping and assigned to whoever is coming up from the emergency department. Administratively, at 10:04 that morning, I stopped being a patient in that hospital. My transport was booked for 1:30. At 20 to 12, they needed the room. There was a man coming up from downstairs who had gone through a windshield, and my bed was the bed, so an aide helped me into a wheelchair and put my 2 plastic belongings bags on my lap and rolled me down to the alcove at the end of the corridor. Every hospital floor has one. It is a nook by the window at the far end, past the linen carts, with 2 vinyl chairs and a table with a dead plant on it, and it is where people go to make the phone calls they do not want to make in the room. From the alcove, you can see the whole length of the corridor, all the way down to the elevator bank, but the chairs face the window, so unless a person is deliberately looking for somebody at that end of the hall, what they see is the back of a head. At 1:15, the transport company called the desk to say there was a wreck on the interstate northbound, and their van was sitting in it. They said 2 hours, maybe more, so I sat there, in a wheelchair, in a borrowed fleece somebody's family had left behind, with my chest tube site aching and 2 plastic bags on my lap, looking out a window at a parking garage, 20 feet from the room I had spent the week in. At about 2:10, the elevator opened and I heard my mother's voice. I did not turn around. I have thought about why, and the honest answer is that I could not have turned around fast in a wheelchair anyway, and by the time that occurred to me, the moment for turning had passed, and I was simply a person sitting very still. She went straight past me. Both of them did. Their heels went by the alcove, and neither one of them looked left. And I want to be very clear that I am not being poetic about that. There was a woman in a wheelchair at the end of that hall, and they walked past her at a distance of about 6 feet. Then the sound of the door of my room, and then nothing for a second. second, and then my sister's voice saying, "Wait, is this the right one?" I heard my mother say the number out loud. 318. She said it twice. I heard the closet, the bathroom door, somebody moving the tray table. It is a very particular noise, a person searching a room that has been stripped, hard surfaces, and no soft things left to muffle anything. And then my mother came out into the corridor and called for a nurse in the voice she uses in restaurants. The charge nurse came down. I could see her from the back, the whole length of the hall between us. A compact woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and she stood in the doorway of that empty room with her arms at her sides. My mother asked which floor they had moved me to, and the charge nurse said, "I'm not able to share that information with you. I don't know. Not let me check. I'm not able to." My mother told her she was my mother. My sister said something about how they had been calling all week. My mother said the word ridiculous twice, and then said loudly enough that a family waiting by the elevator turned around, that she was my next of kin, and she had a right to know where her own daughter was. The charge nurse said evenly that the patient had filed a restriction and that she was required to follow it. And my mother said, "Then show me. Show me where it says that." So the charge nurse walked to the workstation, woke the monitor, turned it a few degrees toward my mother, and read the intake note out loud. Not the restriction. She never showed her the restriction. She pulled up the notification entry from the night of the collision, 7 days old, and she read it in the flat, unhurried voice of a woman reading a med list, standing in the middle of a corridor at 2:10 in the afternoon, with a family waiting by the elevator and an aide stopped halfway out of a supply room with a stack of towels in her arms. She read the date. She read the time. She read that a critical notification had been attempted to the listed emergency contact by speakerphone at the patient's bedside, that the nurse had identified herself and the facility, that she had reported the patient's status as critical and pending emergency surgery, and that family presence had been requested by the attending surgeon. Then she read the quotation, quote, "We're in the middle of a tasting. Your sister has been planning this for a year. The deposit is non-refundable." End quote. Nobody in that hallway moved. My mother said something then. It came out thin and fast, and it was not a denial, which is how I knew it was over. She said that had been taken out of context. She said the woman on the phone had not explained it properly. She said she had been given the impression it was minor. The charge nurse did not argue with her. She looked back at the screen and she read the next line, quote, "Then I'll come when things settle down." End quote. Contact terminated call. And then she read the last line, and she read it slower than the rest, and I have never in my life heard a sentence land the way that one landed. Patient awake and oriented at bedside during notification. I heard that line from 60 feet away with my back to it, and I felt it go through me like cold water. Because for 31 years, the thing I could never make anybody believe was that I had been in the room. Not that it had happened. That I had been there, awake, listening, while it happened, and that everyone had gone on talking anyway. And here was a woman in scrubs saying it into a corridor in a voice you would use to read a lab value. That is what the restriction was for. And the nurse never said so, and she did not have to. Everyone standing in that corridor understood the shape of it inside of 2 seconds. The family by the elevator, the aide with the towels, a man in a windbreaker who had come out of the room across the hall and stopped in his doorway with his hand still on the frame, and my sister, standing 3 feet from her mother in a good coat, holding a set of car keys, who turned her head very slowly and looked at the side of my mother's face like she was seeing a stranger who had just said her name in a parking lot. My mother's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it. She reached one hand back behind her, the way people do when they want the wall to be closer than it is, and it found the door frame of room 318, and she held onto it. She said, "But she's my daughter." Present tense, 7 days late. And my sister said, without taking her eyes off the side of her face, "You told me it was a fender bender." She said it quietly. That is the part I keep. She did not scream it. She did not make a scene out of it. She asked it the way you repeat a number back to somebody to check that you heard it right. And my mother did not answer her, because there is no answer. And because a woman who has spent 30 years managing what 2 daughters know about each other had just run out of the ability to keep them in separate rooms. The charge nurse put the monitor back the way it had been. She said very quietly that if I chose to contact her, I would. And then she picked up a clipboard off the counter and went back to work, because there were 9 other people on that floor who needed something from her. And my sister, still looking at my mother, took 1 step backward, just one. And that step turned her about 30 degrees, and it put her facing down the length of the corridor, toward the window at the far end, past the linen carts, where a woman was sitting in a wheelchair in a borrowed fleece with 2 plastic bags on her lap. I watched her find me. I watched her eyes go past me first, the way they do, and then come back, and then stop. Her mouth went slack. She did not say anything. She did not say my name. She did not lift a hand. She just stood there in the middle of that hallway holding her car keys and looking at me the way you look at somebody you have been told is somewhere else. And my mother, who has spent 31 years reading my sister's face the way other people read weather, saw her stop. She turned around. She looked down that corridor, and she found the alcove, and she found the chair, and she found me in it, awake and oriented, sitting up, breathing on my own, 7 days out of a table, watching her from 60 feet away, with my hands folded on 2 plastic bags that had my whole hospital life in them. I did not wave. I did not nod. I did not do a single thing with my face, and I watched the color go out of hers, not fast, the way it happens in stories. It went in stages, from the jaw upward, the way water goes out of a sink, until she was standing in a public hallway in front of 9 strangers and her 1 remaining daughter with a face the exact gray of the wall behind her, holding on to the door frame of an empty room she had come to 7 days late for money.